Now, the talk I'm going to give today intersects with various interests of mine, and in particular, at the request of Prof. Humla, I'm going to talk about some of the work I've been doing on the humanities, language, or what I call enunciation, and violence, and ways of actually overcoming some of the problems created. But I want to put it in the frame of the humanities. And indeed, this work comes from a larger work that I'm preparing in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, sections of it were from there, but I had to edit it for the purposes of speaking about neighborhood and neighborliness in Rwanda, which was Prof. Humla's request. But in the work that I'm doing, the shadow of James Baldwin falls long and falls extremely relevantly over a whole tradition of writers, Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and of course the remarkable poet with whom I'm working, Claudia Rankine. So let me then start with what I call the framework of the humanities, to talk about language, philology, politics, anxiety, and some kind of reconciliation and neighborliness. I want to start with two citations. The first from Hannah Arendt. Our enchantment with humanity did not even conceive of the terror of the idea of humanity. For the idea of humanity, when purged of all sentimentality, has the very serious consequence that in one form or another, men and women must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by them, and that all nations share the onus of evil committed by all others. To follow a non-imperialist policy and maintain a non-racist faith becomes daily more difficult because it becomes daily clearer how great a burden mankind is for man. My second citation. Perhaps there is a word that captures the meaning of these encounters between victims and perpetrators, and it is grasp. To grasp means both understanding and taking hold of the order. In order to hold of something, one has to reach for it, and here may be found echoes of the phenomenological notion of intentionality. Prof. Humla Bubode Panikise. These two texts that I shall try and find my own voice. Sundar Sarukkai, a renowned Indian philosopher and public intellectual, visited the Trivandrum College for Women in Kerala, South India in 2011 as a member of the board of a national survey on the stature of the humanities. Professor Sarukkai and his colleagues were beset by humanists, students and teachers in a state of insecurity, anguish, and hopelessness. A thoroughly demoralized group stood before us, besieged by numerous problems, ranging from social and domestic tabooing for joining a course in the humanities or social sciences, to the problems of poverty, unemployment, and stark uncertainty about the future. A woman student courageously took the floor and voiced her resentment, the professor's report, with a piquant irony. And this is what she said. Being a Hindu, my parents, teachers, and friends would have pardoned me even if I had eloped with a Christian or Muslim boyfriend. But they couldn't forgive me for deserting the pure sciences and joining a course in the humanities. You may well laugh until I continue. It is easy to miss the cultural complexity of this analogy, the incessant anguish that connects the humanities as an outcast discipline to the Hindu woman's fear of being cast out of family and community for being in a relationship with a boyfriend of another faith. What was in 2011, according to the professors, a piquant irony, is in these days of Hindutva nationalist governance a matter of criminal intent and the cause for a serious violation of privacy. Adult Hindu women, referred to as girls to diminish their respect and autonomy, suspected of having Muslim partners, are now accused of love jihad, on the pretext that they will be seduced by sex into converting to Islam. Hindu women are abducted by gangs of Hindu nationalist vigilantes and returned to their families, where they are held hostage, sometimes forced into marriages, and they'll have to wait until they can appeal to the courts or to NGOs for their freedom. On occasion, they are disappeared or simply killed. The stature of the humanities has steadily declined in India. The status of girl women in India is gravely compromised. More history hangs on an analogy than is immediately apparent. Sundar Sarukai's response to the abandoned women's confession of academic apostasy presents an unexpected challenge. To learn to think like a humanist, he tells his demoralized Trivandrum audience, you should read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. To this excellent curriculum, I would have added Edward Said's fine work of philological humanism, After the Last Sky, Scenes of Regular Life Inside Palestine, Min Dakhil Palestine, which reveals the remarkable power of narrative to endure and enunciate moments when a people's history seems to be in hiatus, lives broken by walls, and memories rendered piecemeal and partial. In Trivandrum, the city of the Indian Rocket Launchpad Project and India's first technopark, Sarukai argues against the curricular privilege afforded to technical and scientific rationalism by the Indian Constitution, and warns that the hegemony of instrumental knowledge could lead to the banality of evil, or as Arendt describes it in a late essay, the non-wicked everybody who has no special motives, and for this reason, having no special motives, is capable of infinite evil. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that lecture hall in Trivandrum, or given the heat of the day, a mosquito on the sleepily revolving ceiling fan. In the absence of either of these attractive Kafkaesque choices, I can only ventriloquize Sarukai's seminar, and in the tradition of some of the best lectures, or the worst, make him speak in my voice. Arendt engages with the banality of evil in my reading by following her own advice that tracing the performance of thinking as enunciation rather than doling out doctrines is the way of moral considerations in the thinking activity. The thinking activity, the performance itself, means that we have to trace experiences rather than doctrines, she writes. Arendt traces the performance of Eichmann's language, and you're familiar with this, as empty talk, cliches, language rules, with the precision of a humanist philologist following the inane activity of thoughtlessness. The longer one listened to him, Arendt observes, the more obvious it became that this inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely, to think from the standpoint of somebody else. To think from the standpoint of somebody else, which is both a moral consideration and an enunciative condition, requires, I believe, a convergence, not a conflation, between issues of consciousness and matters of conscience. And the outcome of this collaboration is what Bernard Williams once fortuitously called ethical confidence. Listen to Arendt for a moment. We call consciousness literally to know with myself the curious fact that, in a sense, that I am also for myself, though I hardly appear to be, which is not so unproblematic as it seems. I am not only for others, and this is the important point, I am not only for others but for myself, and in this latter case, I clearly am not just one. A difference is inserted into my oneness. For myself, articulating this being conscious of myself, I am inevitably two in one. So the whole act of thinking as it relates to consciousness demands the two in oneness. Consciousness is not the same as thinking, but without this alterity, this two in one, thinking would be impossible and consciousness would not emerge. What thinking actualizes in its process is the difference given to consciousness. I will not stray further into Arendt's moral epistemology, moral ontology. I am primarily concerned with the activity of alterity, the two in one, for the purposes of thinking politically and acting ethically. Arendt is careful, more careful than many today, to distinguish an ontological alterity as consciousness from an agential alterity as consciousness. It is the intersection or the interstices of these two forms of alterity that enables what Arendt calls the thinking ego to speak and act from the standpoint of someone else. The struggle with alterity, if I may so describe it, the restlessness, the ambivalence, the phantasmatic structures, the resistance through which the I, as subject, returns to the consciousness of myself after a difference is inserted in my oneness, is an identification with the standpoint of someone else that exceeds the sympathetic surrogacy of speaking in place of someone else. The ethical relation to thinking and speaking that I'm arguing for resonates, I believe, with Levinas's thoughts, not simply on the face, but on what he writes it means to make oneself into a conscience in the context of the interhuman realm of justice, a view to equality and equity, a way, a calculation, the comparison of incomparables, the necessity of thinking together beneath one synthetic theme, the multiplicity and the unity of the world. So not simply the evocation of the ethical face, but this notion of the interhuman, which is not often worked on in Levinas, and in fact that's where the institution emerges into the intimacy of ethics. In a moral fable that could have been written by John Coetzee's wise and utterly obtrusive Elizabeth Costello, Arendt turns to Socrates' contesting dialogue with Hippias to describe what it means to actualize alterity in consciousness with the purpose of activating the moral agency of conscience. Arendt writes, when Socrates goes home, he is awaited by a very obnoxious fellow who always cross-examines him, a close relative living in the same house who compels him to actualize the difference within himself, for moral and political agency. It is only when we actualize the difference within our identity as given in consciousness that we enter the witness box of ethical self-cross-examination and find ourselves in a position that may prevent catastrophes in the rare moments when the chips are down. In Justice Albie Sachs' Königsberger lecture, The Building of an Inclusive Society Based on Human Rights, he provides, I believe, an image of how alterity can be translated into political solidarity. He asks us to imagine his own story, his own experiences, his own performance of thinking from the perspective of, and I quote him, somebody else and somebody else and somebody else of different skin color, different appearance, different language, different background, different beliefs, as agents in the same struggle for the multiple unity of a new South Africa. And this iterative process, somebody else, something else, somebody else, is part, I believe, of not only the process of thinking, but the process of thinking ethically and politically, this iterative return of problems and issues, which I believe is what universalism is about. It's not with what you start, but the things that return undigested to haunt you. It is in the return that we might inscribe something like the universal. The return and its translation. What does it mean to say that to actualize the difference within oneself, actively engaging with the two in one, might prevent catastrophes? Instead of going home to enter the witness box of cross-examination, having done that perhaps, what if we turn towards the world at large when the chips are down and find ourselves impaled at the crossroads of civility and barbarism, caught between humanism and horror, confronted by a worldly entanglement of the two in one? Towards the end of the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt puts us in the place of mere existence, as she calls it, much more effectively than bare life, with the imperative to think from the standpoint of someone else, and from some place else, and from some time else. Deadly danger, she writes, in any civilization is no longer likely to come from without. Even the emergence of totalitarian governments is a phenomenon within, not outside, our civilization. The danger is that a global, universally related civilization will produce barbarians from within its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages. Arendt's indiscriminate and ill-informed reference to savages, here as elsewhere, should not distract us from asking, how does the deadly danger of barbarism emerge from within the interstices of a globally interrelated, or what we would now call connected, civilization? Why does the figure of death inveigle itself into the realm of the human interesser, in Arendt's usage of the term human interest, interesser, something, she writes, which lies between people and can therefore relate and bind them together, this in-between which varies with each group of people, the difference within, and makes possible disclosures of the acting and speaking agent. Why does the deadly danger of barbarism insist in the interstices of human interesse at the point of global connectivity? Behind the barbarism of tyranny stand the institutional presence and the ethical memory of other global regimes, the barbarisms of empire. And it is the post-colonial boomerang between the nation state and its global expansion, problematic though it is, that creates the entangled state of barbarism and as civility. Karuna Mantena summarizes Arendt's concept of the boomerang precisely. I take Arendt's central contention to be that imperialist expansion necessitated the invention of race and bureaucracy as instrumentalities of rule. Think back to Sarupai for a minute. It served both to exacerbate the inner contradictions of the nation state and to degrade Western moral principles and political institutions, so as to make the extermination of peoples appear to be acceptable to state policy. In the same vein, Michel Foucault argues in Society Must Be Defended that although the objective of modern biopower is to make life, it's more interested in the statistics of mortality as governance than in the sovereign power to kill. The lineage of colonial racism, however, leaves a lasting and exemplary memory trace in the institutions of the modern state and its right to kill. And the work I'm doing on Black Lives Matter somehow fits in at this point. The right to kill, Foucault hastily explains, and I want you please to bear this in mind when I use the phrase again, does not mean simply murder as such, but also every form of indirect murder. The fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, global health, for instance, or quite simply political death, social injustice, global injustice, expulsion, resistance, and so on. So he's using it in an extended, figurative, and I think important way. The right to kill, in this extended sense, is closely linked to the political and ethical principle, I believe, of consent, which tyrants destroy and barbarisms besiege, and Arendt considers to be central to the right to have rights. The side-like circulation of the boomerang effect, with its racist cutting edge, degrades the foundational democratic principle of consent, in my view, more abjectly than any other, and prepares the ground for both tyranny and the right to kill. The political principle of genuine consent as the ethical base of the nation state and its citizens cannot be stretched indefinitely. Arendt argues that it is rarely won from conquered people. Indeed, it is for this reason that the subaltern historian Ranajit Guha titles his classic post-colonial work Domination Without Hegemony. And John Stuart Mill, many years before, when confronted with the two-in-one of liberal consent come colonial coercion, places himself in the ethical witness box and asks of himself, I am a democrat in my own country and a despot in another, so what does that make of me? Consent, as a principle of human interesse, creates the ties that bind, which is the basis of being able to think from the standpoint of others. To deny the authority of consent or damage its agential power of speech and action is to bring closer the cold dawn of the right to kill, the risk of death, political death, social death, expulsion, rejection, whether it appears in the guise of the banality of evil or in the undisguised tyranny of radical evil. And when consent withers or is withheld, the oppressed history of suffering groups, a concept in Arendt which I think has not been adequately explored, but is really at the crux of this whole idea of the boomerang. Those who may be stateless or rightless, minorities or dissidents, are nonetheless the outlaws. Arendt writes, completely at the mercy of the police, which it itself did not worry too much about committing a few illegal acts in order to diminish the country's burden of undecided wars. And I feel that one of the themes in the origins of totalitarianism, which I see as central as the concept of statelessness, is the growth of the police state. As barbarism stir in the midst of our own globally interconnected civilization, disjunctive, networked and connected though it may be, the barbarians are no longer at the gates. In the United States, and more recently in Italy, England, Poland, Hungary and elsewhere, Steve Bannon has become the prime proponent of a new barbarism. And this is not my designation. It is his own self-description. In a recent interview with The Economist, Bannon proudly assumes the mantle of barbarism. Speaking of the 2016 US elections, he describes his ideological mission with a flourish. The country was thirsting for change, and Barack Obama didn't give them enough. I said, we are going for a nationalist message. We are going to go barbarian, and we will win. Discrimination and dishonor are two faces of barbaric nationalism, mobilized to denigrate minorities and marginalized populations, whether they are in flight as refugees or at home. Discrimination relies on a biopolitics of calculation and quantification to make a legal and moral case for advocacy on the basis of quotas, data, statistics, numbers, ratios, etc. We believe that discrimination has an appeal to the law. With the right politics and the right legal principles, we can overcome it. Dishonor, which is now emerging hugely in the inflammatory language of politics that seems to be working in the vote banks. Between the last Indian government and the new one, in the last 4 years, hate speech by what is called in India VIPs, that is ministers, government officials, has increased 500%, and most of it came against Muslims. 500% in the last 4 years. Dishonor is about politics of affect, anxiety, fear, death, and destruction. You could optimistically conceive of an end to discrimination, but there can be no formal closure to the informal indignity and violence of dishonor. And it is rising, in my view, everywhere in different forms. For all their brave talk, the lineup of inflated male leaders who dominate the world today, Putin, Trump, Netanyahu, Erdogan, Modi, Duterte, and Maduro, are not politicians of charisma. They are politicians of miasma. And the political rhetoric of dishonor and humiliation they spew creates a fog of war that emanates from their divisive ethnic nationalisms as they rise in the guise of saviors to return to people a sense of their true blood and their primordial belonging. It is always in a kind of future. These leaders embody the arrogant self-concentration of tribal nationalism, as Arendt defines the phenomenon as a populist majoritarian politics that always insists that its own people is surrounded by a world of enemies, one against all, that a fundamental difference exists between this people and all others. It denies theoretically the very possibility of a common mankind long before it is used to destroy the humanity of man. These reflections, originally provoked by Professor Sarukai's lecture on banal evil to the down-at-heart humanists in Trivandrum, has sent me to other subjects, engaging alterity to think from the standpoint of someone else, the enunciative and ethical complications of the loss of consent, the institutionalized right to kill, the police borders, and the barbarians within the gates. These thoughts return me to the post-genocide testimony of Jean-Baptiste Maniakore, a teacher of the humanities in the Nyamata region of Rwanda. He says, what happened in Nyamata, in the churches, in the marshes and the hills, are the supernatural doings of ordinary people. The headmaster and the school inspector struck blows with their own hand. A priest, the magistrate, the assistant chief of police, a doctor, killed with their own hands. These learned people were calm and they rolled up their sleeves to get a firm grip on a machete. So for people like me, who have taught the humanities their life long, criminals such as these are a terrible mystery. By this stark and unforgiving mention of the humanities, in the midst of an account of such intimate and internecine violence, the right to kill, it would have felt quite different if I had come upon a mention of human rights, or humanitarian intervention, or even human beings in the context of genocide. But the connection between teaching and killing, between the humanities and violence, between the doctor with the scalpel and now the doctor with the machete, left me stunned and lost. In a conflict charged with the tensions of a politics of identity and ethnicity, with the torsion of sameness and difference, it was the rhetorical element, the element of denigration, the element of dishonor as we hear it today, as it is repeatedly referred to in the brilliant National Unity and Reconciliation Commission report in Rwanda that ushers in the death knell of genocide and brings Jean-Baptiste, the teacher of the humanities, face to face with the terrible mystery of the death of humanity. The rhetorical element is listed as a major structural cause of the genocide in the report, along with other factors such as extreme poverty, the shortage of resources, corrupt undemocratic governance, human underdevelopment, and the refugee camps in Tanzania. The rhetorical element here, what I call the ethics of enunciation, becomes a policy issue as crucial to the remaking of citizenship as legal identity or the protection of individual and group rights. The death-dealing, verminous abuse hurled at Tutsis have been heard too often. The Tutsis are cockroaches or snakes. Radio, television, les mille collines, broadcast day and night with a pallbearer's punctuality. The graves are only half filled. Who will help us fill it? But this is not the whole story of the rhetorical element as the archive tells it. In the Human Rights Watch report, Leave None to Tell the Story, the late and great Alison Deforge carefully documents the frequent and lethal uses of the rhetorical element to serve the purposes of what the NURC report refers to as a genocidal strategy, as an accusation in the mirror against a projected, reflected, imagistic notion, or what it calls the psychopolitical phenomena of demonization and dehumanization. And in the larger chapter, I go into this in great detail. In my reading of the genocide, mediated through the rhetorical and political framework of the NURC report, suggests that the bipolar world of Hutu and Tutsi, as the conflict's most brilliant historian, Mohammed Mamdani, describes it, has always been stalked by a virtual yet vicious third party, the phobic phantasmatic object, a close relative of Carl Schmitt's concept of the enemy, who is a rhetorical figure projected onto ethnic relations, the accusation in a mirror. As such, the politics of existential fear, as the report calls it, exists everywhere and nowhere legitimizing the right to kill. What the rhetorical enemy provides is a rigid, polarizing boundary between Tutsi and Hutu that incites and excites the death drive of violence. The rigidity of this bipolar boundary is in inverse proportion to the metaphoric and figurative malleability of the rhetorical element. The propaganda message, the projected accusation in a mirror, has an empty, fabricated reference, alleging various false Tutsi transgressions that don't occur. But the phantasmatic aim and object is the spreading of an existential fear that embodies the right to kill and legitimates it. The NURC report rightly concludes that, and I quote, deathly otherness is not rational, but that does not prevent it from being functional in society. I wish the several million-word report after 9/11 had showed anything of this insight and political wisdom of the Rwandan report, which is a mere few pages, 100 pages. If the distancing of industrial technology and rural killing fields marked the event of the Holocaust, then the genocide in Rwanda, in Mamdani's phrase, was very much an intimate affair. It was banal in the temporal sense of a sudden and radical disordering of the ordinary, and this evisceration of everyday life. The Interahamwe death squads worked roughly a 9-to-5 routine, called away from their carnage by a bell or a pistol shot. Their killing machines were agricultural implements that belonged to the banality of everyday labor. But the Rwandan tragedy was also banal in the archaic meaning of the word banal that relates to customary and communal life. It was a genocide of neighbors and neighborliness. As a member of the Rwanda Patriotic Front explained, in Germany the Jews were taken out of their residences, moved to distant, faraway locations and killed there, almost almost. In Rwanda, the government prepared the population, but your neighbors killed you. In my view, the bipolar identities of ethnicity and racialization do not adequately acknowledge that other essential modality of customary power and conflict, the concept of neighborliness. And it is the hard work of reconciliation to turn the boundaryless projected enemy as the phobic third person that incites the right to kill into the arrentiant two-in-one of the neighborly relation. The relation of the neighbor as a hybrid figure of semblance and difference, the stranger and the familiar as the essential difference inserted into the oneness of national solidarity and customary community. Neighborliness is the effective and domestic aggressive customary power, and as a locality, the neighborhood serves to define a legal and ethical jurisdiction. In both oral testimonies and recorded history, the neighborly relation constitutes the interpolative connection between Hutus and Tutsis. As often as Hutus and Tutsis, in my reading of the archive, refer to each other in those ethnic and racial terms, they also refer to the other, even indeed refer to the other more frequently as neighbors, even in the midst of the violence. The record is around neighbors. The neighbors becomes a kind of collective subject, and the neighborly relation does not either belong to you or me. To be a neighbor is a relation. It's somewhere in between, which is why I say that that third enemy in between has to be replaced then, after the great infraction, with the neighbor as that third space that works in between. As a relational reality, neighbor belongs wholly neither to Hutu or Tutsi. It is a liminal form of partial identification and double identification that moves in between ethnicities, registering the unstable differential tension between ethnicity and race, while acknowledging in the same temporal framework the spatial and ethical proximity of Hutu and Tutsi in the village of Naima. As a step through reality, the neighborly relation is the nexus of a diverse range of writings, not by unifying or homogenizing them under one head, but by creating an iterative intertextuality that gives neighborliness a high degree of narrative authority without claiming any authenticity for itself as the arbiter of first causes. As an interstitial reality, the neighborly relation emphasizes the mysterious suddenness with which neighbors turn into members. A member of the Interahamwe Hutu killing squads recalls his uncanny, self-alienating experience of turning to his neighbor with a firm grip on his machete. You will excuse me for having to lean over my pages, as I've even more than I've been doing, because the line becomes actually quite difficult to read. I had killed chickens, but never an animal with the stoutness of a man, like a goat or a cow. In truth, it came to me only afterward. I had taken the life of a neighbor. I mean, at that fatal moment, I did not see in him what he had been before. Thank you, sir. Oh, no, you don't have to hold. Please, I'll let you do this. Thank you so much for your neighborly kindness. So after this act of kindness, let me return to the heart. In truth, it came to me only afterwards. I had taken the life of a neighbor. I mean, at that fatal moment, I did not see what he had been before. I struck someone who was no longer, and this I think is the crucial phrase, either close or strange to me in the nature of neighbors, who wasn't exactly ordinary anymore. I'm saying, like the people you meet every day, I'm not sure you can truly understand me. I knew him by sight without knowing him. The incipient instability and tension in the realm of neighborliness is clearly marked in Pio's Hutu perspective on his ordinary peacetime relation to his Tutsi neighbor, as someone to be a neighbor who is to be both close, which is part of the post-70s recognition of minority status of Tutsis, and strange, the lineage, I believe, the long lineage of racialized colonial identities that were constructed into tribal affiliations in a larger strategy of divide and rule. You have to be both close and strange in order for that tension of neighborliness to work. Otherwise, if the two are crushed together, then you are exposed to kind of vulnerability on one side and violence on the other. Pio's strange syntax, someone who was no longer either close and strange to me, who wasn't exactly ordinary anymore, expresses the complex negotiation of neighborly accommodation within the contradictory and conflictual intersections of customary in civic power that has dogged the history of Rwanda. Neighborhoods are the borderline and frontier spaces in the theater of genocidal war. Neighborliness is the unstable, inflammable social agency in the regimes of customary power. The neighbor occupies an excessive supplemental space of thirdness, neither only Hutu or Tutsi, neither only indigene or alien, neither simply ethnic or racial, part customary, partially civil, part citizen, part stranger. The neighbor is the hybrid relation that circulates between groups, that is both the horror and the hope of Nyamata and elsewhere. What might seem like a terrible mystery in the neighborly relation should not let us forget for a moment that there were victims and genocidaires, the dead and the quick, the right and the wrong. What is paradoxical is that within the profound asymmetry there survives an affiliative nerve of memory after the genocide that drove a great number of Hutu and Tutsi away from the UN-sponsored TRC and drew them to congregate around the Grassman or Gacaca courts. The African Rights Report on the Gacaca trials, confessing to genocide, conspicuously locates the subject of truth and testimony on the site of moral memorial and the political knowledge of neighborhoods, its spatial networks, its customary laws, its diurnal temporality, its memory of namely negotiation, its epistemological and enunciative practices of orality, narrative, and conviviality. Although the new codifications and procedures of the Gacaca trials have adopted a great deal from international law, truth commissions, and Western jurisprudence, in many respects, truth remains a dialogic, legal, and moral practice in which the neighbors play the role of the Greek chorus. Noah Weisbord's eyewitness report, written under the supervision of my colleague Marco Minnow, suggests that because the aim of Gacaca is reconciliation and not adjudication, itself, I believe, a neighborly ethic and hermeneutic, the individual parties to the dispute in these small, tight-knit communities depend on popular participation. The inquiry of truth, I believe, depends on the memory of neighbors, and the very possibility of reconciliation depends on the mnemonic repetition of, amongst other things in the transcripts, neighbors' names and places in order to relocate oneself, to re-establish the memorial jurisdiction of custom and kinship rather than abstract rules after the genocide. I shot them all. I nearly knew all of them. They were Calix and Bonigada. Josephine, brought by Frederic. A child of Nyakazulu. Finally, an old woman, Anastasie, brought by my neighbor, Bernard and Martin. Despite their vastly different fates, both the genocidaires and their victims display a sustained sense of the value of the commonplace, of the ordinariness of fate. The destruction of the ordinary plumbs the depths of evil, and at the same time, the survival of the ordinary provides a measure of moral and social recovery. Indeed, the banality of what is held in common. The schoolhouse, the hospital, the church, goats, sheep, and cows, banana beer, primus beer, cabarets, machetes, become the most intimate and imminent instruments of youth. Yet, years after the genocide, it is these intimate instruments of a shared community of fate that enables the Rwandans to rebuild their lives. Amongst ourselves, we never grow tired of talking about this post-genocide state of things. We talk to one another about the moments we went through. We swap explanations, and we tease one another. It is ordinariness that has the capacity to provide for a communal life that impures intriguing phrase, requires that the neighbor is recognized for his ordinariness, his alterity. I struck someone who was neither close or strange to me, who wasn't exactly ordinary. And it's almost as if that uncertainty of the neighbor, that is neither close nor is he unfamiliar, creates that moment of justice, of law, of ethical reasoning. It stills you for a moment. It stops you from the imminence, and it makes you go back and forth thinking. It's that is so important that this young genocidaire should have said, I didn't recognize him as my neighbor because I was not put in that state of recognizing and not recognizing, which is actually what the ordinary does. And it is because the ordinary pivots on that moment of recognition and not recognition that I believe it is capable of reconciliation. To be either strange or close is not simply to be the one or the other. It is to articulate a sense of relationality that moves between strangeness and closeness. Let me end with a poem that I believe sums up in many ways, or part of the poem, what I've been talking about, to speak from the standpoint of others, to engage with barbarism that comes from within connected civilizations and not without. And finally, the importance of the moment of unsatisfaction, or what Locke once called disappointed hope, as the place of revival and reconciliation. The ability to withstand the trauma, and also then the ability not to forget it or repress it, to work with it, to work around it, to have it beside you when you think, as indeed the two-in-one. I said, finds an echo in Adrian Rich's remarkable prescient book of poems, An Atlas of the Difficult World. I have returned to her verses on several occasions in different ways to engage what it would mean to establish a measure, a combination of poetic, meter, and political vision in order to construct a global memory of history's rights and wrongs. To end with a poem seems particularly appropriate in this context. Perhaps Pace Adorno, poetry should have its tongue untied, but there is no more subtle and subversive art form that is capable of coaxing silence to speak louder than words. From the perspective of philological and rhetorical humanism, Rich's poem artfully balances the articulacy of pain and protest with the hiatus of history. Each verse, each event, each subject, in its own iterative measure, confronts a syntax of caesuras, forms of silence in which the poem makes a space for the translation of its hopes and desires into the practices of everyday, ordinary neighborliness. This is the great militant lyric of speaking of the world and acting in the world from the standpoint of someone else. Memory says, want to do the right thing? Don't count on me. I'm a canal in Europe where the bodies are floating. I'm a mass grave. I'm the life that returns. I'm a table set with room for the stranger. I'm a field with corners left for the landless. I'm an immigrant tailor who says, a coat is not a piece of cloth only. I have dreamed of Zion. I have dreamed of world revolution. I'm a corpse dredged from a canal in Berlin, a river in Mississippi. I'm a woman standing with other women dressed in black. I'm a woman standing with other women dressed in black on the streets of Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. There is spit on my sleeve, and there are phone calls in the night. I stand on a road in Ramallah with naked face, listening. I am standing here in your poem, unsatisfied. The moral witness is caught in a double time frame of memory, surviving the testimony of the past while striving to possess the freedoms of the future. The temporal layering of memory consists, one might say, of a past that refuses to die, confronted by a future that will not wait its turn to be born. In between them lies the narrow and necessary history of the present. With all its constraints, it is the place from which we act and speak, from the standpoint of someone else. This may not in itself be enough to keep the barbarians at bay, but the memory of Neighbours as a medium of recognition, repair, and reconciliation, with its narratives, its dialogues, its teasing, its jokes, its experiences, its conversations and negotiations, has the power to break the stealth and silence with which the banality of evil destroys the hope and faith of ordinary life and ordinary people. Thank you.